The Social Contract, or the Principles of Political Rights, by Jean Jacques Rousseau. The Social Contract. Book 1. I wish to discover whether, in the existing social order, there may not be some rule of safe and legitimate administration, taking men as they are, and laws as they might be. I shall try to ally in this research that which the law permits with that which interest prescribes, so that justice and utility may not be divided. I enter upon this discussion without proving the importance of the subject. I shall be asked if I am a prince or a legislator, that I write about politics. I shall answer no, and that for this reason I write about politics. If I were a prince or a legislator, I should not lose time in telling what ought to be done. I should do it or be silent. Born citizen of a free state and member of the sovereign people, however feeble the influence of my voice in public affairs, the right to vote upon them imposes upon me the duty of instructing myself. Whenever I meditate upon governments, I am happy to find in my investigations new reasons for loving that of my own country. Chapter 1. Subject of the first book. Man is born free, and he is everywhere in chains. A man believes himself the master of others, but is for all that more a slave than they. How is this brought about? I do not know. What could make it legitimate? I think I can answer this question. If I considered force alone and the effects derived from it, I should say, as long as a people is compelled to obey and obeys, it does well. As soon as it can shake off the yoke, and shakes it off, it does better. For recovering its liberty by the same right by which it was taken away, either a people is justified in recovering its liberty, or there was no justification in taking it away. Social order is a sacred right which serves as a basis for all others. But this right does not come from nature. It is founded upon conventions. We must know what these conventions are. But before reaching that point, I must establish what I have just asserted. Chapter 2. The First Societies. The most ancient of all societies, and the natural one, is that of the family. Yet children remain dependent upon the father only as long as they have need of him for self-preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children, exempt from the obedience which they owed to the father, exempt from the care which he owed to his children, become equally independent. If they remain united, it is no longer naturally, it is voluntarily, and the family itself is maintained only by agreement. This common liberty is a consequence of the nature of man. His first law is that of self-preservation. His first cares are those which he owes to himself, and as soon as he has reached years of discretion, he alone, being judge of the means necessary for his preservation, becomes thereby his own master. The family is then, if you will, the first model of political societies. The chief is the father, the people are the children, and all being born equal and free, alienate their liberty only for their benefit. All the difference is that, in the family, the love of the father for his children pays him for his care of them, and in the state the pleasure of commanding makes up for the love which the chief has not for his people. Grotius denies that all human power is established in favor of those who are governed. He cites slavery as an example. His most ordinary mode of reasoning is to establish right by fact. A method might be employed which would be more logical, but not more favorable to tyrants. It is doubtful then, according to Grotius, whether mankind belongs to 100 men, or the 100 men belong to mankind, and he seems throughout his book to lean to the first opinion. It is also Hobbes's opinion. So here is the human species divided into herds, each having a chief who guards only to devour it. As a herdsman is of a nature superior to his herd, the pastors of men, who are their chiefs, are also of a nature superior to their people. The Emperor Caligula reasoned thus, according to Philo, concluding from this analogy that kings are gods, or that the people are brutes. The reasoning of Caligula amounts to that of Hobbes and Grotius. Aristotle said before any of them that men were not naturally equal, but that some were born for slavery, and others for domination. Aristotle was right, but he took the effect for the cause. Every man born in slavery is born for slavery. Nothing is more certain. Slaves lose all in their chains, even the desire to leave them. They love servitude as the companions of Ulysses loved brutishness. If then there are slaves by nature, it is because there has been slaves contrary to nature. Force made the first slaves. Their cowardice perpetuated them. I have said nothing of King Adam, nor of Emperor Noah, father of 3 great monarchs who shared the universe, as did the children of Saturn, whom some think they recognize in them. I hope I shall receive credit for this moderation, for descending directly from one of these princes, and perhaps from the elder branch. How do I know whether, by the verification of titles, I should not find myself the legitimate king of mankind? However, that may be, it cannot be denied that Adam was sovereign of the world, as Robinson of his island, as long as he was the only inhabitant, and what was convenient in this empire was that the monarch, safe upon his throne, had neither rebellion, nor war, nor conspirators to fear. Chapter 3. The Right of the Strongest. The strongest is never strong enough to be always master, unless he transforms his strength into right and obedience to duty. From this comes the right of the strongest, a right taken ironically in appearance and established really in principle. Strength is physical power. I do not see what moral force could result from its action. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will. It is at the most an act of prudence. In what sense could it be a duty? Let us for a moment grant this pretended right. I say that there would result from it only an inexplicable muddle, for as soon as it is strength that makes right, the effect changes with the cause. Any force which overcomes first succeeds to the right. As soon as disobedience can be practiced with impunity, it can be practiced legitimately. And as the strongest is always right, it is only necessary to arrange always to be strongest. Now, what is a right which perishes when strength ceases? If obedience must be rendered to strength, it is not necessary to obey from duty, and if obedience is not exacted, it is not necessary to obey. It may be seen then that the word right adds nothing to strength. It has no significance here. Obey them that have the rule over you. If that means yield to force, the precept is good but superfluous. I answer for its never being violated. All power comes from God. I acknowledge it. But all sickness comes from him too. Does that mean that it is forbidden to call a physician? If a brigand surprises me in a wood, I am forced to give him my purse. But if I could conceal it, am I in conscience bound to give it up? For the pistol which he carries in his hand is power. Let us agree then that strength does not make right, and that obedience only to legitimate power is obligatory. So my original question comes up again. Chapter 4. Slavery. Since no man has natural authority over his kind, and since strength does not make right, there remains only agreement for the basis of all legitimate authority among men. If one individual, said Grotius, can alienate his liberty and make himself the slave of a master, why cannot a whole people alienate its liberty and make itself subject to a king? There are many words there which require explanation, but let us take the word alienate. To alienate is to give or sell. Now a man who makes himself the slave of another does not give himself, he sells himself at the least for his subsistence. But a people, why should it sell itself? A king is far from furnishing his subjects their subsistence. He draws his from them. And according to Rabelais, a king does not live upon little. Subjects, then, give their persons on condition that their goods shall be taken also. I do not see what they have left to preserve. It will be said that the despot assures his subjects civil tranquility. So be it. But what do they gain by it, if the wars which his ambition brings upon them, if his insatiable avidity, if the vexations of his ministry despoil them more than their own dissensions? What do they gain by it, if this tranquility is itself but a misfortune? Tranquility of life can also be found in a prison. Is that enough to bring contentment? The Greeks shut up in the Cyclops' cave lived there tranquilly, waiting their turn to be devoured. To say that a man gives himself gratuitously is to say something absurd and inconceivable. Such an act is illegitimate and null, for the reason alone that he who has done it is not in his right mind. To say the same thing of a whole people is to suppose a people of madmen. Madness does not make right. If each man could alienate himself, he could not alienate his children. They are born men and free. Their liberty belongs to them. No one else has a right to dispose of it. Before they have reached years of discretion, the father can, in their name, stipulate conditions for their preservation, for their welfare, but cannot give them away irrevocably and without condition, for such a gift is contrary to the ends of nature and exceeds the rights of paternity. It would be necessary, then, in order that an arbitrary government be legitimate, that in each generation the people be at liberty to admit or reject it. But then the government would no longer be arbitrary. To renounce liberty is to renounce the quality of manhood, the rights of humanity, and even its duties. There is no possible compensation for him who renounces everything. Such a renunciation is incompatible with the nature of man, and it takes all moral force from his actions to take away all liberty from his will. Finally, it is a vain and contradictory agreement to stipulate absolute authority on one side and obedience without limit on the other. Is it not clear that there is no obligation towards one from whom you have the right to demand everything? And does not this one condition without equivalent or exchange involve the nullity of the act? For what right would a slave have against me, since all that he has belongs to me, and his right being mine, to talk of my right against myself is absurd. Grotius and others find in war another origin of the pretended right of slavery, the conqueror having, according to them, the right to kill the conquered. The latter can buy back his life at the expense of his liberty, an agreement the more legitimate as it turns to the profit of both. But it is clear that this pretended right to kill the conquered results in no way from the state of war, from the fact alone that men, living in their primitive independence, have not among themselves relations sufficiently permanent to constitute either the state of peace or the state of war. They are not naturally enemies. It is the relation of things and not of men that constitutes war, and as it is impossible for war to arise from simple personal relations, but only from property relations, private war or war between man and man can exist neither in the state of nature where there is no permanent property, nor in the social state where all is under the authority of the laws. Single combats, duels, and encounters are acts which do not constitute a state of war, and in regard to private wars, authorized by the establishments of Louis IX, King of France, and suspended by the peace of God, they are abuses of feudal government and absurd system, if ever there was one, contrary to the principles of natural right and of all good polity. War, then, is not a relation between man and man, but a relation between state and state, in which individuals are enemies only by accident, not as men, nor even as citizens, but as soldiers, not as members of the country, but as its defenders. Finally, each state can have only other states, not men, for enemies, because between things of such different natures, no real relation can be fixed. This principle conforms to the maxims established in all times, and by the constant practice of all civilized nations. Declarations of war are less notifications to the powers than to their subjects. The foreigner, whether he be king or individual or people, who steals, kills, or confines subjects without declaring war to the prince, is not an enemy, but a brigand. Even in open war, a just prince seizes, perhaps, anything that belongs to the public, but he respects the person and property of individuals. He respects rights upon which his own are founded. The object of war being the destruction of the enemies of the state, the conqueror has the right to kill its defenders as long as they bear arms. But as soon as they yield their arms and give themselves up, they become men simply, and the conqueror has no further right over their lives. Sometimes a state may be killed without killing a single one of its members. War gives no rights which are not necessary to its object. These principles are not those of Grotius. They are not founded upon the authority of poets, but they are derived from the nature of things and are founded upon reason. In regard to the right of conquest, it has no foundation except the law of the strongest. If war does not give to the victor the right to massacre the vanquished people, this right which they have not cannot be the foundation of one to enslave them. The victor has not the right to kill the enemy except when he cannot enslave him. The right to enslave does not come, then, from the right to kill. It is then an unjust exchange to make him buy with his liberty his life, over which no one has any right. In establishing the right of life and death upon that of slavery, and the right of slavery upon the right of life and death, is it not clear that we reason in a circle? In supposing even this terrible right to kill everybody, I say that a slave made in war, or a conquered people, has no obligations with regard to his master, except to obey him as long as he is forced to do it. In taking an equivalent for his life, the victor has not spared it. Instead of killing him without profit, he has killed him profitably. He is far from having acquired any authority over him except that of force. The state of war exists between them as before. Their relation itself is the effect of it, and the exercise of the right of war supposes no treaty of peace. They have made an agreement, so be it. But this agreement, far from destroying the state of war, supposes its continuity. Thus, from whatever direction the subject is regarded, the right of slavery is null, not only because it is illegitimate, but because it is absurd and signifies nothing. The words slave and right are contradictory. They mutually exclude each other. Whether from man to man or from man to a people, this discourse will always be alike senseless. I make an agreement with you, entirely at your expense and to my profit, which I will observe as long as I please, and which you will observe as long as it pleases me. Chapter 5. Returning to the first agreement. Should I accord all that I have refuted up to this time, the abettors of despotism would be no further advanced. There will always be a great difference between subduing a multitude and governing a society. If scattered individuals are successively enslaved by a single man, in whatever number it may be, I see in it only a master and slaves. I do not see a people and its chief. It is, if you will, an aggregation but not an association. There is neither public property nor political body. This man, had he enslaved half the world, would still be but an individual. His interest, separated from that of others, is always a private interest. Should this man die, his empire would remain after him, scattered and without union, as an oak dissolves and falls in a heap of cinders after having been consumed by fire. A people, says Grotius, can give itself to a king. According to Grotius, a people is a people before giving itself to a king. This gift is a civil act. It supposes public deliberation. Before examining, then, the act by which a people chooses a king, it would be well to examine the act by which a people becomes a people. For this act, necessarily preceding the other, is the true foundation of society. In fact, if there were no previous agreement, where would be, unless the election were unanimous, the obligation of the minority to submit to the majority? And how would 100 who desire a master have the right to vote for 10 who do not desire it? The law of plurality of suffrages is itself established by agreement and supposes unanimity at least in the beginning. Chapter 6. The Social Compact. I suppose man arrived at a point where obstacles, which prejudice his preservation in the state of nature, outweigh by their resistance the force which each individual can employ to maintain himself in this condition. Then the primitive state can no longer exist, and mankind would perish did it not change its way of life. Now, as men cannot engender new forces, but can only unite and direct those which exist, they have no other means of preservation than to form by aggregation a sum of forces which could prevail against resistance, and to put them in play by a single motive and make them act in concert. This sum of forces can be established only by the concurrence of many, but the strength and liberty of each man being the primary instruments of his preservation, how can he pledge them without injury to himself, and without neglecting the care which he owes to himself? This difficulty, as related to my subject, may be stated as follows. To find a form of association which shall defend and protect with the public force the person and property of each associate, and by means of which each, uniting with all, shall obey however only himself, and remain as free as before. Such is the fundamental problem of which the social contract gives the solution. The clauses of this contract are so determined by the nature of the act that the least modification would render them vain and of no effect, so that, although they may perhaps never have been formally enunciated, they are everywhere the same, everywhere tacitly admitted and recognized until, the social compact being violated, each enters again into his first rights and resumes his natural liberty, thereby losing the conventional liberty for which he renounced it. These clauses, clearly understood, may be reduced to one, that is, the total alienation of each associate with all his rights to the entire community. For first, each giving himself entirely, the condition is the same for all, and the conditions being the same for all, no one has an interest in making it onerous for the others. Further, the alienation being without reserve, the union is as complete as it can be, and no associate has anything to claim for, if some rights remain to individuals, as there would be no common superior who could decide between them and the public. Each, being in some points his own judge, would soon profess to be so in everything. The state of nature would subsist, and the association would necessarily become tyrannical and useless. Finally, each giving himself to all, gives himself to none. And as there is not an associate over whom he does not acquire the same right as is ceded, an equivalent is gained for all that is lost, and more force to keep what he has. If, then, we remove from the social contract all that is not of its essence, it will be reduced to the following terms. Each of us gives in common his person and all his force under the supreme direction of the general will, and we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Immediately, instead of the individual person, of each contracting party, this act of association produces a moral and collective body composed of as many members as the assembly has votes, which receives from this same act its unity, its common being, its life, and its will. This public personage, thus formed by the union of all the others, formerly took the name of city, and now takes that of republic or body politic. This is called the state by its members when it is passive, the sovereign when it is active, and a power when comparing it to its equals. With regard to the associates, they take collectively the name people, and call themselves individual citizens, as participating in the sovereign authority, and subjects, as submitted to the laws of the state. But these terms are often confounded and are taken one for the other. It is enough to know how to distinguish them when they are employed with all precision. Chapter 7. The Sovereign. We see by this formula that the act of association includes a reciprocal engagement between the public and individuals, and that each individual contracting, so to speak, with himself, finds himself engaged under a double relation, i.e., as member of the sovereign to the individuals, and as member of the state to the sovereign. But the maxim of civil law, that no one is bound by engagements made with himself, cannot be applied here, for there is a great difference between an obligation to oneself and to a whole, of which the individual forms a part. It should be observed, too, that public deliberation, which may bind all subjects to the sovereign, on account of the two different relations under which each of them is considered, cannot for the contrary reason bind the sovereign towards himself, and that consequently it is against the nature of the body politic that the sovereign impose upon himself a law which he cannot infringe. Being unable to consider himself except under the one relation, he is then in the position of an individual contracting with himself, whereby it is evident that there is not and cannot be any sort of obligatory fundamental law for the body of the people, not even the social contract. This does not mean that the body cannot engage itself perfectly towards others, in that which is not derogatory to this contract. For with regard to the foreigner, he becomes a simple being, an individual. But the body politic or the sovereign, deriving its existence only from the sanctity of the contract, can never bind itself even towards others to anything which is derogatory to this first act, as to alienate some part of itself, or to submit to another sovereign. To violate the act by which it exists would be self-annihilation, and that which is nothing produces nothing. As soon as this multitude is thus united into a body, one of the members cannot be injured without attacking the body, and still less can the body be injured without the members feeling its effects. Thus, duty and interest alike oblige the two contracting parties to mutually aid each other, and the same men should seek to unite under this double relation all the advantages which may be derived from it. Now the sovereign, being formed only of the individuals comprising it, neither has nor could have interests contrary to theirs. Consequently, the sovereign power has no need of guarantee towards the subjects, for it is impossible for the body to seek to injure all its members, and it will be seen hereafter that it can injure no one in particular. The sovereign, by the fact alone that it is always what it must be. But this is not true of subjects towards a sovereign, to whom, in spite of common interests, nothing binds them to their engagements unless means are taken to assure their fidelity. In fact, each individual can, as man, have an individual will contrary to or different from the general will which he has as a citizen. His individual interest may speak quite differently from the common interest. His absolute and naturally independent existence may make him consider what he owes to the common cause as a gratuitous contribution. the loss of which would be less injurious to others than the payment of it would be onerous to him. And regarding the moral entity which constitutes the state as a legal fiction, because it is not a man, he would like to enjoy the rights of a citizen, without being willing to fulfill the duties of a subject, an injustice, the progress of which would cause the ruin of the body politic. In order, then, that the social compact may not be an idle formula, it includes tacitly this engagement, which alone can give force to the others, that whoever shall refuse to obey the general will shall be compelled to it by the whole body, which signifies nothing if not that he will be forced to be free. For it is this condition which, giving each citizen to the country, guarantees him from all personal dependence, a condition which forms the device and working of the political machine, and alone renders civil engagements legitimate, which without that would be absurd, tyrannical, and subject to great abuse. Chapter 8. The Civil State. The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces in man a very remarkable change, by substituting in his conduct justice for interest, and giving to his actions a moral force which they lacked before. Then only does the voice of duty succeed to physical impulse, and law to appetite, and man, who until then had thought only of himself, sees himself forced to act upon other principles, and to consult his reason before listening to his desires. Although he deprives himself in this state of several advantages which he holds from nature, he gains other advantages so great. His faculties exercise and develop, his ideas expand, his sentiments become ennobled. His whole spirit is elevated to such a point that, if the abuse of this new condition did not often degrade him below that from which he came, he ought to bless without ceasing the happy moment which took him from it forever, and which has made of a dull, stupid animal an intelligent being, a man. Let us reduce all this account to terms which may be easily compared. What man loses by the social contract is his natural liberty, and an unlimited right to anything that tempts him, which he can obtain. What he gains is civil liberty, and the ownership of all that he possesses. Not to be deceived in these compensations, we must distinguish the natural liberty, which has no limits but the strength of the individual, from civil liberty, which is limited by the general will, and possession, which is only the effect of the force or right of the first occupant, from the ownership which is founded only upon a positive title. After what precedes, there ought to be added to the credit side of the civil state that of moral liberty, which alone renders man master of himself. For the impulse of one appetite is slavery, and obedience to self-prescribed law is liberty. But I have already said too much about this. The philosophical meaning of the word liberty is not a part of my subject here. Chapter 9. Realty. Member of the community gives himself to it, as soon as it is formed, such as he then is, himself and all his force of which his property forms a part. It is not that, by this act, the possession changes its nature in changing hands, and becomes property in the hands of the sovereign. But as the strength of the city is incomparably greater than that of an individual, the public possession is also, in fact, stronger and more irrevocable, without being more legitimate, at least as regards foreigners. For the state, in regard to its members, is master of all their property by the social contract, which in the state serves as the basis of all rights. But the state is not master with regard to other powers, except by the right of the first occupant which it holds from individuals. The right of the first occupant, although more real than that of the strongest, does not become a true right until after the establishment of that of ownership. Every man has naturally a right to everything that is necessary to him, but the positive act which makes him proprietor of certain property excludes him from the rest. His part being taken, he must limit himself to it, and has no further right to the community. This is why the right of the first occupant, so weak in a state of nature, is respected by every man in civil life. Under this law, that which belongs to others is less respected than that which is not one's own. In general, to authorize the right of the first occupant upon any territory, the following conditions are necessary. First, that the land shall never have been occupied. Second, that only such a quantity be occupied as will be necessary for subsistence. Third, that it be taken possession of not by an empty ceremony but by labor and cultivation, the only sign of ownership which, in default of legal title, should be respected by others. In fact, in according to necessity and labor the right of the first occupant? Is it not going as far as would be justifiable? Can the limits of this right be defined? Would it suffice to set foot upon common territory, and to profess immediately to be its master? Would it be enough to have the force to remove other people for a moment, in order to take from them the right ever to return? How can a man or a people seize upon an immense territory, and deprive all the rest of mankind of it, otherwise than by punishable usurpation? For they take from other men the dwelling, place and food which nature gives them in common. When Núñez Balboa took upon the shore possession of the South Seas and all South America, in the name of the Crown of Castile, was that enough to dispossess all the inhabitants, and to exclude from it all the princes of the world? Upon such a footing these ceremonies multiplied uselessly, and the Catholic king had only suddenly to take possession of the whole universe, cutting off only from his empire what had previously been possessed by other princes. It may be conceived how the lands of individuals united and contiguous become public territory, and how the right of sovereignty, extending from the subjects to the lands which they occupy, becomes at the same time real and personal, which places the possessors in a state of greater dependence, and makes of their force itself a guarantee of their fidelity, an advantage which seems not to have been appreciated by monarchs of former times, who called themselves kings of the Persians, of the Scythians, of the Macedonians, seeming to regard themselves as chiefs of men rather than masters of the country. Those of today call themselves more clearly kings of France, Spain, England. In thus holding the territory, they are quite sure of holding the inhabitants. What is singular in this alienation is that, far from despoiling the individual in accepting his property, the community assures him of its legitimate possession. It changes usurpation into a veritable right, and enjoyment into ownership. The owners now being considered as depositories of the public property, their rights being respected by all the members of the state, and maintained with all their force against the stranger, by a transfer which is advantageous to the public, and more so to themselves. They have, so to speak, acquired all that they have given a paradox easily explained by the distinction of rights which the sovereign and the proprietor have over the same property, as will be seen later. It might happen, too, that men began to unite together before possessing anything, and that taking possession of a territory sufficient for all, they enjoy it in common, or divide it among themselves either equally or in the proportions established by the sovereign. In whatever way the acquisition is made, the right which each individual has over his own property is subordinate to the right which the community has over all. Without this, there would be neither solidity in the social tie nor real force in the exercise of sovereignty. I will finish this chapter and this book by a statement which must serve as the basis of all social systems. It is that, instead of destroying natural equality, the fundamental compact substitutes, on the contrary, a moral and legitimate equality for that which nature may have given of physical inequality among men. And while they may be unequal in strength or genius, they become equal by agreement and right.